Hey, good day, everybody. Today is day 2 of the U.S. Biochar Initiative Biochar funding opportunity utilizing the USDA NRCS code 336 and 808 soil carbon amendments. So, got a great event for you today. Lots of interesting panelists. We're going to have to take a little bit of a different approach today. The communications went so well yesterday with our Q&A sessions. We're going to be a little more conversational today. Go ahead and take some deep dives to answer your questions. I do want to remind you that this is being recorded and will be published to a streaming service within the next 1 to 2 weeks. When that is, we will notify you via email. So for anybody that registered. I do want to let you know that this does qualify for CEUs for the certified crop consultant. So email me after the event and I'll submit the paperwork for your credits. So thank you for attending, everybody. Quick notice about the U.S. Biochar Initiative. We are a not-for-profit organization, and we promote the sustainable production and use of biochar through research, policy, and implementation. We work with a lot of biochar producers. We work with a lot of agronomists. We work closely with industries and associations. We do consulting with NRCS and a number of other federal agencies. Forestry partners, we have a close relationship with the U.S. Forest Service. We do equipment development. We do a wide range of things. We are volunteer-based, so we do count on your donations to help us move things forward. We will be at the Compost Conference next week, so if anybody is going to the 2023 Compost Conference, be sure to stop by our booth and say hello, talk to us. So, and again, any biochar producers that are out there, I'm going to remind you that we do have that active directory on our website, and to sign up for that. As well, USBI has an excellent newsletter that we produce monthly, so please do go to our site and sign up. My name's John. I'm the Director of Communications for the U.S. Biochar Initiative. I have been a biochar producer for a little over 3 years now. I have a commercial pyrolyzer here in Salt Lake City. So I'm familiar with the field from a couple of different angles, and I tell you, there's never been a better time to be in the biochar business, and there's never been a better time to build soil health. So day 2 program panelists, we've got the Biochar Atlas with Kristin Trippe. We do have Pacific Biochar with Josiah Hunt and Charles McIntosh. Hey, Josiah. And then we have the USBI Board of Director, Tom Miles, the man, the myth, the legend, and he will be talking about safety today. So then we're going to have a presentation from Phil Blom, and the Web Soil Survey, which is also a fantastic tool. And that conversation with Richard Reid is also going to be wrapped in with Kristin's presentation. So we do need to give a big shout out and thank you, and to let everybody know we really appreciate our financial sponsors today. That's what makes programs like this available. So we have the U.S. Composting Council, American Farmland Trust, Grain Ecosystems, BioASA, Wakefield Biochar, Go Biochar, and then a tremendous amount of thanks has to go out to the U.S. Forest Service for a significant amount of funding for this event, and a fantastic partner for U.S. Biochar Initiative. So our schedule on day 2, again, this is about a 3 hour and 15-minute session. We will have a break in the middle. We're going to start out with this intro, and we're going to be moving on to Kristin's presentation on the Biochar Atlas. She will show us about how to utilize the tool and what it means, and how to understand biochar lab reports. It's going to be very interesting. She's going to be paired with Richard Reid, who's going to be giving an overview of his Web Soil Survey tool. And then Josiah Hunt's going to be talking about a new project that we have going on for the U.S. Biochar Initiative to help folks understand their biochar journey and utilization in soil. That's when we're going to take our short break. And then Josiah and Charlie from Pacific Biochar will be back on. They're going to talk about their experience working with producers who are installing soil biochar and working with codes 336 and 808. After that, we'll be speaking with Phil from TerraChar. He's going to be talking about biochar practices on farm. This is going to cover things like utilization with poultry, some composting, and other items. So it's real practical, down to earth, fantastic information. Then Tom Miles We'll be kind of closing us up with discussion on shipping, storage, and safety, and the practical practices that you need to be aware of when you're working with biochar. We'll have a very brief set of closing remarks. And then one of the best parts of this, that we're going to have an extended Q&A that will go until 4 p.m. Eastern. Yesterday, we had so many fantastic questions. This was packed until the very last moment. So anyone that we didn't get to your questions yesterday, we are sorry about that. We're working on follow-up responses. Again, I would want to give you a reminder that we will be publishing this video, and we'll let you know when it's there. We will also provide supporting documentation, and we're working with everybody to get the slide decks released, so that way we can put those up on the USBI website. So, and those will all be provided to you in an email as follow-up. So with that, we're about to start session 1, and I want to introduce you to Kristin Trippe. So Kristin, if you can start your video and come on in. Kristin heads up the Biochar Atlas, the Pacific Northwest Biochar Atlas project, and she is as you can see, she's a research microbiologist, and we're really looking forward to today's session. So Kristin, I'm gonna go. You should be able to go ahead and start sharing your screen. Hey,
you see my main screen?
Yes, we do.
Sweet. Okay. So good morning, afternoon, morning from the West Coast. What I want to do is quick introduce myself. My name is Kristin Trippe. I'm a research microbiologist at the USDA Forage Seed and Cereal Research Unit here in Corvallis, Oregon. And before I start, I just want to thank a few people. I want to thank John for inviting me and for organizing the meeting and accommodating all the last minute changes we've had over the last month. So thanks for all your hard work. I'd also like to thank our sponsors. We couldn't be here without them. And I'd like to thank you for spending your morning or your afternoon with me. I appreciate it. And I hope that the work I'm about to show you can help you make decisions about biochar. I've been working in biochar for about a decade, and our efforts have been focused on trying to understand how to better pair biochar with specific soil deficiencies. Over the last 2 years, biochar is finally being recognized by the government as a climate smart ag practice. So I'm excited to work across agencies to collaborate on expanding the use of biochar in ag, and whether that's forestry or field crops or even other sectors. Really like working with folks to how to find the right biochar for the right application. So I'm excited to be here to share this work with you, to hear feedback about our efforts to make biochar more accessible and more effective for end users. But I also want to recognize some of the people who did the work that I'm going to show you today. Claire Phillips was a postdoc in my lab. She did a lot of work on the back end of this when she was a postdoc. Now she's at the USDA in Pullman, Washington. I'd also like to recognize Adam Lindsley, who did a lot of the work designing the MAP interface. He's now an assistant professor in data sciences at Oregon State. And the work was funded by the USDA Climate Hub and the USGS Climate Adaptation Centers. NRCS has started an agreement with us called the National Biochar Agreement, and we'll talk a little bit more about that at the end of my presentation. So just a quick outline. Oh, hang on, my slide's not advancing. There we go. So just a quick roadmap of today's talk. I'll give a brief introduction, talk about some of the existing tools that we have that you can use to inform biochar-based decisions, including the NRCS practice. And then I'll move into interpreting biochar reports to answer questions like, how much carbon am I adding to the soil? And then talk about some common biochar conversions. Josiah is going to follow up with that and show you some calculators you can use as well. And then we'll move into some brief economics, talk about expansion of the current tools in partnership with the NRCS and other folks. And then if there's a little bit more time, I'm hoping you can provide me some feedback and ideas about how to make this tool more useful for you. So just some brief introductory slides. I'm going to assume that most people know what biochar is, but just so we're all on the same page, I know there's some folks out there who haven't used it before. So what is it? Well, the most easy definition is that It's biochar is charcoal that's added to the soil. And usually we use this in the context of agriculture and environmental remediation. Given that definition, biochar is really different from fly ash or paper mill waste because the key to biochar is that it's produced in the absence of oxygen, which means that unlike some of those more ashier products, it's not completely combusted, which leaves these dense carbon structures that you can see up here. And these dense carbon structures can be quite functional in the soil. The other thing that I'd like to note is that unlike ash, biochar retains the framework of the parent material. So here you can see in this micrograph of a conifer biochar, you can see it retains the cellular structure of the wood. And just to contrast that, here's some straw biochar, and you can appreciate just how different that is on the molecular level. So we've all heard that biochar fills the needs of agriculture in several ways. To just talk about a few examples, in the Pacific Northwest, there's just a desperate need to create markets for low-value wood biomass to spur the implementation of silviculture treatments that reduce wildfire risk. Studies have shown that the production of biochar from low-value wood sequesters carbon compared to pile and burn and other business as usual scenarios, and that the utilization of biochar increases soil health and crop yields generally. In other regions of the country, biochar can be produced from things like poultry litter or manure, diverting those raw materials away from soils where they can cause nutrient leaching into waterways. The biochar produced from poultry litter can be applied to soils, or it can be reapplied to poultry houses where it can reduce ammonia or improve animal health. It can be used as a compost additive. It can be a sustainable replacement for other soil amendments. It can absorb toxins. But these sort of stories of sustainable synergies is what draws so many of us into biochar research. And as John mentioned yesterday, there's no lack of research on biochar. This is a recent Web of Science search. And you can see that there's over 25,000 publications since 2009. I looked yesterday and there's 174 meta-analyses on biochar. But despite this sort of vast knowledge base, biochar agronomic practices aren't being widely adopted. And to be quite frank, I don't think this is super surprising. With any new discovery, there's what they call a technology curve or a hype cycle that describes how adoption of that technology happens. And just to think about this for a minute, when a new technology emerges, there's a lot of enthusiasm and hope that that technology will revolutionize an industry. And this is called the peak of inflated expectations. However, as barriers as barriers to the adoption are experienced, this peak is quickly followed by the trough of disillusionment, which sounds really awful, but it just reflects that the technology isn't as straightforward as we thought. However, as that technology is improved and the barriers start to be lowered, as we learn more, we move through the slope of enlightenment until that technology is ultimately adopted. With biochar, I would say that right now we're in that slope of enlightenment. So that's a really exciting time. But to move towards this plateau of productivity, I'd like to offer that the barriers to adoption need to be addressed. And those barriers are lack of grower guidelines, standards, and best management practices, and the ability to predict outcome and cost benefit. And so today, I'm going to tell you about a decision support toolkit that we built to lower some of these barriers. So as I said, there's 25,000 research articles on biochar, and those research articles, some of them address what biochar can and cannot do in soils. And so you can see, looking at this meta-analysis that was done in 2012, biochar may or may not do lots of things. So just for those who aren't familiar with response ratios, if you're looking at a response ratio that's on this side of the graph, it's generally not responsive. If you're looking at one over here, it is. So if we look at above and below ground biomass improvement, you can see that generally biochar additions do help that. They also, but they may probably reduce tissue nitrogen concentration. They probably don't have a huge effect on soil inorganic nitrogen. They change pH, but what you can see is that we know for sure that biochar sequesters carbon, and that's shown here in that almost every study where biochar is added to the soil that we have a boost in carbon. So we also know that biochar can do things like reduce acidity, retain nutrients, increase microbial biomass, and we know that it improves yields sometimes. But that yield improvement generally happens when we match the right biochar with the right soil deficiency. And that's what I'm going to talk to you about today. So one of the main barriers to the adoption of biochar-based technologies is the very thing that makes biochar so cool to begin with, that they're tunable, that they are diverse, and that their physiochemical properties are different based on, what just happened here? Their physical chemical properties are different depending on what they're produced from and how they're produced. So here we've got a biochar that's made from 3 different feedstocks: hazelnut shells, invasive juniper, and poultry litter. And you can see just by looking at these biochars that they're really different on the macro scale, but they're also really different on the molecular level. So let's take a look at that. If we just compare the poultry litter and the hazelnut and look at the type and amount of carbon in those biochars, you can see that the hazelnut has a lot more stable carbon than the poultry litter. And much less ash, which lowers its fertilizer value. But it gets even more complicated than that. So as we increase the production temperature here, we more than double it. You can see that the volatile carbon in the poultry litter turns to ash, whereas the volatile carbon in the hazelnut biochar tends to turn to stable carbon. So you can see that the production and the feedstock conditions have a profound impact on the molecular properties of a char, and that in turn significantly impacts the way that the char interacts with the soil and the plant to provide fertilizer value, which is shown in this top graph, and liming value, which is shown on the bottom. But it also affects a whole host of other properties, including hydrophobicity, water holding capacity, particle size, and microbial impact. So the point of the slide is to just say that just looking at a biochar without knowing anything about it, it's going to be difficult to predict how that biochar will interact with soil and plants. So the question is, can we match biochars with soil and crop needs? So when I get calls from farmers asking me how they can implement biochar practices, I don't really have a right answer to give them, because biochar can't be applied as a one-size-fits-all solution. Biochars vary in their physiochemical properties and the types of benefits they can offer, and soils vary in their deficiencies. So to answer sort of this fundamental question of what kind of biochar to use and how much to use is consistently, well, what are you trying to accomplish? What's the limiting factor in your cropping system that you're hoping to ameliorate with biochar? And how much of biochar do you need to accomplish that? And so if this sounds familiar, it might sound a lot like nutrient management, right? So to skip to the punchline, in order to get the most benefit from your biochar, or for any soil amendment for that matter, you have to identify cropping goals, identify products that can address those goals, and then use those products at a rate that makes sense. And of course, like I said, this sounds a lot like the 4 R's: using the right rate, the right place, the right source, and the right time. These principles are really important for correctly utilizing fertilizer, but using biochar to improve soil health and crop yields requires similar thought. Now, I think Richard's going to jump in and talk about choosing the right place.
Hey, everybody, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Great, that's awesome. So thank you for the opportunity to speak today. As Kristin mentioned, on the Biochar Atlas, I was sort of added to this agenda kind of last minute, but this presentation on the web soil survey interpretation dovetails very well with the Biochar Atlas, and so I think it adds value to the webinar. So, like I said, thank you for the opportunity to speak. I would be remiss not to give full credit to a co-author of this presentation and really the mastermind behind the web soil survey interpretation we're exploring today. Bob Dobos is a soil scientist with USDA NRCS Soil and Plant Sciences Division, and he is at the National Soil Survey Center in Lincoln, Nebraska. My name is Richard Reid. I'm a soil scientist with the Central National Technology Support Center in Fort Worth, Texas. And I will display our contact information at the end of this presentation so that questions may be directed to either of us. So let me know when you can see the next slide.
You're good. Okay.
So just a little bit of background, sort of the bigger picture items, the what, why, where, how. There's been a renewed interest. I don't think there's any denying that in the use of biochar as a soil amendment recently. That sort of follows the research that Kristin was showing. So biochar is particularly useful in conservation planning to address resource concerns, such as organic matter depletion. And it has taken a center stage recently in planning activities, not just on cropland, though, ironically, but also on pasture, forest, and urban land. So biochar, as you know, and we've been exploring in this webinar, is an amendment that has been proposed to benefit soil properties and qualities, such as AWC, pH, soil structure, which has a profound impact on permeability, bulk density, and nutrient holding capacity, among others. So biochar can be expensive to apply. So there is most certainly a need to identify those soils which have a potential to see the benefits that it can provide. Adoption, as Kristin mentioned, may be directly related to the return on investment of applying biochar. And so this idea or concept of where do we apply biochar based on an expected yield increase is that is used in the soil interpretation is sort of based on the research by Doku Hockey, where they explored both the probability and the magnitude of crop yield response when biochar is used to improve yield limiting soil properties. We'll just leave it at that. And so this map was created as a result of their research. And this depicts areas of the country in which we would expect to see yield increases as a result of biochar application. And so it sort of follows with what we know about productivity of soils across the continental United States. In Iowa, where we have super productive soils, maybe we don't see quite as high of a yield increase based on the application of biochar, whereas, or conversely, where we have poorer soils, we would expect maybe a higher yield increase. There we go. So to give a little background on the development of this interpretation, it kind of all started with a gentleman named Brandon Smith, who was a former, I think, a program coordinator for the Soil Health Division. Not sure about that title, but he had a wonderful idea to build this screening tool for conservation planners to aid in helping to determine where biochar may provide the best results or potentially the best return on investment. And so just to give you a little background on the sort of the framework within Soil and Plant Sciences Division, we have this broad interpretations focus team, which is comprised of several sub-teams. Bob Dobos teaches a class on the science of interpretations, which is mentored by several of us on the larger interpretations focus team. So this class cunningly provides both members and function for the science component of the interpretations focus team. This venue allows us to address interpretive needs through a specific channel to accomplish interpretive projects quickly. So basically, after literature review and research has taken place, we develop what's called a criteria table, which is then translated into this fuzzy logic system of our sort of our internal NASA's client database. And that is done by members of the designing and developing interpretations subgroup, which is, again, another component of the larger interpretations focus group. So to give you an example of what a criteria table looks like when it's done, here's an example of the criteria table used for the dynamic soil properties response to biochar interpretation. And if you note that both soil and site properties are included in the criteria table, here we attempt to assemble and also sort of qualify values from the literature based on their impact on soil use. So taking pH, for example, from 0 to 30 centimeters, we know that below a pH of 5.5, that the application, generally speaking, of biochar is going to provide some pretty good results. The soil is going to respond to that application fairly well in the form of a yield increase. Whereas above a pH of 7.5, we're probably not going to see as much of a beneficial response to the application of biochar. So some soil and site properties cannot be changed on a human timescale by the application of biochar. These types of properties include things like slope, karst topography, flooding, ponding, stones in the surface horizon, those types of things. It's hard for us to change. And so the way I look at these soil properties and site properties is sort of a one-to-one relationship to the overall interpretation. If the slope is too great on, say, cropland, for example, you're probably not going to be able to apply it. If your site floods on let's say cropland, if your site floods, the application of biochar probably is not going to provide a good response because there's risk of it washing away, right? So I look at those properties as having sort of a one-to-one relationship. Conversely, these other soil properties, which we can hopefully change for the better by the use and application of biochar, we call these dynamic soil properties, and these can be changed by use and management, as you all know. These properties sort of work in concert with each other to impact the level of influence on the overall interpretation. So in theory, while any one property alone doesn't necessarily make a soil suitable or unsuitable, a collection of those properties may have a stronger influence. So how does the interpretation work? So this is an example of how the fuzzy logic system in the NASA's client handles soil property data. So this example shows pH on the x-axis, and on the y-axis, we can see the overall response or suitability. So 0 means not suitable and 1 means highly suitable. Below a pH of 5.5, we would expect the largest benefit or the largest response. And above a value of 7.5, we would expect the least benefit or the least response, with some fuzziness to the level of benefit in between those two values. So this is one of about 15 soil and site properties that is used in the soil interpretation. So more importantly than all the background and all this discussion is probably how to get to this interpretation. So it's as easy as 1, 2, 3, sort of. Search your browser for Web Soil Survey, not to be confused with Soil Web, which is a different web platform that is also useful for viewing and disseminating soils information. You're going to click on the link to Web Soil Survey, click on the green Start Web Soil Survey icon, and then next you navigate to your area of interest, however you choose to do that, whether it's typing in an address, entering a Latin long, importing a shapefile, something like that. And then you create your area of interest. And there are several ways to create an area of interest. You can use a shapefile. You can use a fixed rectangle. You can use a freeform polygon. However you choose, you do it, double click, and then that will take you to the soil map tab, which will delineate out your area of interest and provide a soil map. So after each soil and site property is evaluated, here is an example of the interpretive output for the dynamic soil properties response to biochar interpretation, which is available in Web Soil Survey. This shows the expected response of the application of biochar to selected soils. This provides a great planning tool on where on the ground we can expect the best result from the application. So as you can see by the arrows, you navigate over to Soil Data Explorer, Suitabilities and Limitations for Use tab, which is where all of our thematic interpretations are stored. And then over on the Soil Health Explorer pane, you can navigate down to Dynamic Soil Properties Response to Biochar. And you'll notice there's a few different options here. View description will take you to the metadata for the interpretation, which includes criteria, a brief description, the literature citation. Under advanced options, you'll see different options for aggregation, which I'll talk a little bit more about here in just a second. And then you can also view rating. So when you click view rating, you'll get a map with the different rating and the rating reasons for each map unit. So here are two soil map units from a Maryland farm. Each map unit has a slightly different overall map unit rating. We can expect good dynamic soil property response to biochar applications on the GGB map unit, and slightly less of a response on the GGC map unit circled in red. So keep in mind, for each soil map unit, that is listed here, GGB and GGC, there are one or more components that may be present within those map units. And the rating reasons are listed for each major and minor component. It is important to know which component or components you have present on your area of interest. Although the soil map unit may have a good response overall, there may be minor components that have less response and may not provide the return on investment. So with that, I think that is the end of my discussion. If you have any questions or feedback on the Web Soil Survey interpretation for dynamic soil properties response, please feel free to reach out to either Bob Dobos or myself, and we will do our best to answer your questions. Thank you.
Hey, Rich, it looks like Josiah has a question.
Sure.
Yeah, thanks for the offer to reach out directly. I was wondering if you're going to be around for any of the Q&A sessions scheduled for later, or if you got to jump out right now.
I do have to jump out for a 12 o'clock meeting, but I can call back in as soon as that meeting is over.
That is very gracious of you. Thank you so much. And is there any way you can provide the email information or contact information
in the chat?
Yeah, in the chat or something.
Sure. Yeah, I sure can.
Thank you so much. Oh, actually, I see it right there. You've put it on that last slide. Perfect.
Yeah, and we'll be sure to include it. We do have a couple of questions inside the Q&A. Do you have any time right now, or would it be better if you could come back later?
I think I have a few minutes here, so we could probably field a few questions if I can answer them. If I can, I'll get back with
well, it's so the most recent one is, if you apply biochar to a soil that has a high pH, will it continue to increase the pH to problem levels? Oh, whoops. That's not for you. The next one up is for you. Can you use this tool to satisfy the low organic matter eligibility requirements for soil carbon amendment 808-336?
Ooh, that's a good question. Yeah, technically, I would think that a low organic matter requirement would be organic matter depletion resource concern. And so, yes, biochar could be used as a tool, along with compost, perhaps, to to increase the organic matter and get you where you need to be.
Okay.
Yes, I guess on that same pH, sorry to jump in, on that same pH question, a lot of the farmers that we're working with are using lime, gypsum, and sulfur to be adjusting their pH on a regular basis anyways. So is there any way that we can turn off the pH filter to look at the outcomes?
Turn off the pH filter.
Meaning
well,
like the pH would not influence what the predicted outcomes would be?
Yeah,
Since
ironically,
the farmers are, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Ironically, in the interpretive model right now, pH is sort of handled the same as a lot of the other soil properties that would influence response to biochar application. It is thought that pH is a pretty large driver in whether a soil is responsive or not. So if they're applying a lot of lime and they've got their pH where it needs to be, they may or may not see as much of a response to biochar applications as if the pH was naturally or inherently low. So we could explore that. Perhaps
it's been something we've seen quite a bit, particularly on the higher side of pH, because farmers with a higher pH, native pH, are consistently using amendments to control that within a better range, and so thus the web soil survey might show that a positive response is unlikely, but yet in experience we see significant positive response. And so since pH is something that's adjusted fairly easily with lime, gypsum, and sulfur, I was wondering if it would be possible in the future, or if it's possible right now, to be able to turn that function off while leaving the rest of them active.
Well, we could certainly diminish its level of influence in the interpretation,
but that would have to be done into the coding of the system.
That's right.
Okay, but that answered it perfect. Thanks.
Awesome. And then we have a question from Loretta for you, Richard. It says, in the biochar interpretation, could aluminum amount be added as criteria, particularly in tropical and subtropical soils?
It could, yes. Although I think that pH factor, where we have it set at 5.5 being the absolute most responsive, below pH is a 5.5 is where you're really going to start to see aluminum become, more readily available. And so, I would have to give some thought on aluminum availability related to pH and see if there's added benefit to incorporating aluminum. Then the other thought too is how good or how valid is the aluminum data that we have within our internal database. These are all constraints that we have to sort of live off of, and if the aluminum data that we have is minimal or is not as reliable, then pH may be the best soil property that we have to get at that. I don't know if that answers your question or
not. Yeah, I think it does. Let's see here. Oh, Carol just published your contact information in the Q&A for everybody that's interested in it. So there's one comment that maybe I can get your input on, and then we can, I know you have another meeting to get to. It says, while the tool is interesting, I think states NRCS will likely require some degree of site-specific data, e.g. soil tests prior to planning and contracting 336. So, I think we're all in agreement with that typically the application of biochar is going to be multidisciplinary in the number of tools and resources that you're going to look to. Again, the U.S. Biochar Initiative is available to provide assistance with your local NRCS agents, but ultimately it's going to be up to them and you to determine your pathway. So yeah, that was good input. Let's see here. I think I kind of just stepped on that for you. So
No, that's fine. That's a great point. So with any soil interpretive screening tool or high level assessment, there is always a site specific investigation that would be needed if you really wanted to take it to the next level, and to to determine what soil components you have present, what within the soil map units that are mapped, and and determine if the assessment or the screening tool that you use is correct, or if it needs improvement or whatever. So there's a difference between a high level assessment and a site specific application, for sure.
Yeah, thank you. I agree. So let's see. Richard, thank you. I'm hoping you can jump back on here in just a bit after your next meeting and join us for the Q&A down the line. So thank you so much. Will do.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks, Richard.
Thank you. All right, Kristin, I think it's back to you now.
Thanks, Richard, for joining at like the last possible minute. I thought he would make a great addition, and he really did set me up for this. There was a question in the chat. Obviously, there's 4 R's in nutrient management: the right place, the right time, the right source, and the right rate. But nutrient management is really seasonal, right? So when is your crop there to take up the nutrients that you're applying? Biochar isn't so much, it is a nutrient source, but it's not a very big nutrient source. And so putting it at the right time isn't as important in nutrient management. So so right now we're really focused on the 3 R's of biochar management. So sorry for that confusion. Again, we're using these principles from nutrient management to inform the amendment strategy. Now, Richard just gave us this great presentation on how to find the right place using tools within the web soil survey. But I would say, while that tool is amazing, again, you can make this decision by looking at soil lab reports, and you can kind of qualitatively make this decision just by looking at your ground, right? I mean, most farmers know where on their farm they've got poor water infiltration, where they've got low amounts of carbon, or what areas of their farm are just generally unproductive. So, so unlike fertilizer, which always comes with a nice label on it, biochars don't always come with NPK or lime values on the package. So to develop a decision support tool, we need to know the physiochemical properties of different biochars. And while there's no federal regulations for labeling biochars, to use the NRCS practice standard, you do need to have it evaluated by a laboratory. The lab analyses that are required are generally based off of standards developed by the International Biochar Initiative, which created this biochar classification system to describe biochars using those metrics. Our decision support tool is based on this same system. So I just want to point out a few aspects of it. The system describes biochar's agricultural impacts in 4 areas: a biochar's ability to provide long-term carbon storage, provide plant nutrients, neutralize soil acidity, and the particle size of the biochar, which likely influences soil retention and water infiltration and retention. Although I will say the theoretical framework that predicts how water responds to biochar has not really been worked out yet. But overall, this system provides a basis for comparing biochars so that a user could make informed decisions about selecting the most appropriate biochar for their application. Again, these 4 areas we think can be robustly predicted from easily measured biochar properties. So this classification system from IBI gives a quantitative prediction of the impact biochar would have on soil. For instance, when you look at the fertilizer class for this just general label, the number 4 shows that it has high concentrations of 4 nutrients in plant extractable forms: phosphorus, potassium, sulfur, and magnesium. And the subscripts shown here will show that it takes, for example, 2 tons of P to meet the requirement for corn, or 2 tons of potassium, 5 tons of sulfur, and 3 tons of magnesium. What this suggests is that if you know a crop's nutrient requirements, and it can be any crop, here it's for corn, you could apply the right amount of biochar, perhaps in combination with other nutrient sources to meet that crop demand. Similarly, if you have a target pH, you can calculate the amount of biochar you need to make that adjustment. The classification is the framework of our decision support tool and uses this accounting-based approach to figure out those 3 R's I talked about. Okay, so let's take a look. Here's the tool. It's available at pmwbiochar.org. If you want, you can go there. If you just want to follow along, I'm going to go through some main features of the site. When you land on the homepage, there's a bunch of these little flip boxes on here, and we hope that these will help folks gain a basic understanding about biochar by providing educational content, case studies, research highlights. You can find a producer or compare different biochars. But what I want to spend a lot of time on today is the toolkit, which can be found up here under tools in the main toolbar. So if you want to start this process by getting some information, you want to start this process by getting some information about your soils. And you can do this in one of two ways. If you're living in the Pacific Northwest, you can type in an address, click on a Google map, and get information about the soil series, the predicted nutrient status, physical properties about your soil, like predicted texture and organic matter, and then also predicted moisture properties and predicted chemical properties like pH, EC, and extractable P. Now, the case study we're looking at today is not in the Pacific Northwest, so we can't pull that information from the map. However, if we click through to the next box on the site, we can manually enter it from a soil test. And lucky for us, our case study, in this case, the farmers provided very detailed soil test results from a soil health benchmark study. So we can enter those values to start to identify some of his soil deficiencies. And in some ways, this is even better because the data that the map pulls up from the Surgo database and all that information is based on soil map unit. It doesn't account for past management strategies, nutrient management, or prior amendments. The map's a great place to start if you know nothing about your soil, but if you have a soil test, that's even cooler. So I'm glad to show an example that's not in the Pacific Northwest. Again, this is the first step of our biochar selection tool, which prompts you to identify the needs of your soil. And based on that, you can select management goals. Based on those goals, you can identify a biochar at a rate that makes sense. So here's some information that was given us by the grower, and you can see that he's already got a fairly high amount of organic matter. You could remember back here, the map that was generated by the Web Soil Survey in these green areas was showing that this farm has low organic matter, but this farmer is really interested in adding carbon to his soil, and so he puts a lot of compost. He raises cattle, so there's a lot of manure impact. So his organic matter is actually at 4.6%. Here's some fertility data from his soil test. His pH is 6.5, and here's his texture results. So once that information is gathered, either through the map or through soil tests, the system will help you identify deficiencies. It starts by evaluating your organic carbon value. Here you can see that the farmer has sufficient organic carbon values in his soil. And next, the tool is going to tell you about the fertility. But that fertility information is really important to do through the lens of the crop that you're planting. To contextualize our recommendations, we uploaded extension requirements for 40 Pacific Northwest crops. And here they're listed. You can see that we've got common vegetables like asparagus and sweet corn, forage and seed crops like alfalfa and clover, and then berry crops like raspberry and blueberry. Again, these are all Pacific Northwest crops. I'll talk about how we're going to expand this a little bit later. So, again, understanding that this is not the Pacific Northwest, a lot of these values still translate. So this farmer raises cattle on his ground. So here we pick pasture as the crop of interest. And you can see that according to Pacific Northwest standards, his potassium's on the really low side. It also tells me about other nutrients, including potassium. If you scroll down, there's a lot more, but you can see that those are also low. And I just didn't have room on the slide to show you. Okay, so again, if you click through, you can see that we also get information about pH. And here, this is in a really good range for his crop. If it was too low, the tool would tell me how much liming material to actually add. And then it will also tell me, according to soil texture, about hydraulic or water properties, including plant available water and infiltration. Okay, so Oh, hang on a second. Okay, so now after getting some information about the soil and the crop needs, we can start to choose some goals. And there's a lot of sort of pre-listed goals within this system, including sequestering carbon, goals regarding water, nutrients, microbial activity, and reducing salts or binding heavy metals. Now, based on the information we got from our farmer, I picked 3 goals. Now, this farmer is really interested in carbon, wants to continually add carbon to the system. So even though his carbon is on the high side, which is 4.6, we can still add sequestering carbon as a goal. We want to increase phosphorus and increase water retention on his farm. So after we've identified the goal, the tool searches our database and ranks biochar choices depending on the goals. So it tells me which biochars match those 3 priorities. So for the first priority, which was sequestering carbon, it's going to choose a high temperature wood biochar where all that carbon can be locked up in those stable ring structures that I showed you at the beginning of the talk. For the second goal, we're going to increase phosphorus. It's going to choose a really ash heavy biochar like poultry or white oak. For water holding capacity, it suggests a really high temperature biochar. And then it's going to put it all together and make a suggestion based on rank. So here you can see which ones were chosen for priority 1, 2, and 3. And then the biochars that match the most priorities are going to be recommended. So here you can see that Oregon white oak is probably going to be the best biochar for your bang in this situation because it might fit at least 2 of your needs. So once I identify a biochar, I can choose from my library to find out how much carbon and nutrients I can obtain from different amendment rates. For example, here it tells me that for a particular wood biochar at 0.5 tons an acre, you can add 900 pounds of carbon per acre. No, or 900, that can't be right. Oh, that's pounds per acre, sorry. So you're going to be adding 914 pounds per acre if you use 0.5 tons per acre biochar. And so you can see how that's ranked. Sorry about that. But how do I get those numbers? Are they realistic? What if the biochar you're picking isn't in our database? How can you figure out what the added benefits of biochar are at a particular amendment rate? So now I'm going to go through some tests. So I'm going to diverge from the atlas for a minute to go over a typical lab report that you might get from this suite of analysis recommended by the IBI and that are also required by the practice standard. And I'm going to review how you might take those results and use them in a meaningful way to inform your amendment strategy. So shown here is sort of this typical lab report, and you can see that there's just a lot of information on there listed about physical, chemical properties. Some of these are really important and have a huge impact on soil fertility and carbon. Others are good information because if you're going to use biochar for the 336 practice, it needs to meet regulatory thresholds for metal. But today we're just going to focus on agronomically important features. 2 important features that we're going to continue to come back to are moisture content and bulk density. Nearly all of these parameters are required for bone, or nearly all of the sort of metrics you're reading on this report are done on bone dry biochar. So we need that moisture content to back calculate how much fertility you're adding and to do most of the calculations we're going to go through. Keep in mind that if you deliver the biochar to different moisture content, all the calculations need to be readjusted for that moisture content. So moisture content is just that, how much water is in your biochar sample. So I think the most important calculation that most of us are interested in is understanding how much carbon you're adding to the soil. Biochar contains 3 kinds of carbon, and I talked a little bit about this at the beginning of the slide. I showed those pie graphs. I think I've got one actually on here. There it is. We've got these pie graphs, and these are the 3 kinds of carbon. You've got inorganic carbon in the form of ash, you've got stable carbon in the form of big ring structures, and then you've got volatile carbon, which is really available for microbial food. These 3 parameters are measured using a technique called proximate analysis, where we just progressively combust the carbon to determine how much of each fraction we have. And these should add up to 100%. This is, again, the value that I showed. And I'll say that the amount of C, stable C, is important for carbon sequestration, and the amount of ash is particularly important in determining liming value and also fertilizer value. Now we'll see the HC ratio of the H carbons, and the HC ratio is a ratio of the hydrogen atoms to carbon atoms in the biochar sample. This is a measure of how stable the biochar will be in soil. And that's because if you've got a biochar that doesn't have a lot of hydrogen atoms in it, it's really hard for microbes to attack that and requires a lot of energy. So it's more energetically costly to break this biochar down than if you've got a biochar that has a higher HC ratio, so more hydrogen, and then those carbon bonds are more labile. Therefore, HC ratio is just a measure of biochar stability. Now, using these values, it's pretty straightforward to calculate how much carbon you're adding to the soil. Specifically, you need the fraction of organic carbon in the biochar, the moisture contents, and the application rate. So using the value on this lab analysis and assuming you're amending at 10 tons an acre, we're just going to multiply the organic carbon fraction by the decimal percent water content, by the application rate to get, in this case, 4.6 tons of organic carbon per acre. And again, this is the organic carbon. This is not including the inorganic carbon that's in the ash contents. So how much of an addition is this to existing soil stocks? Well, it all depends on how deep the biochar is applied and how much of the field is being amended. If you're amending to an acre furrow slice, and for those who aren't farmers, an acre furrow slice is 6.7 inches deep, which is generally, how deep farmers used to plow. You can assume that the weight of the soil in an acre weighs about 1,000 tons. So if we add 10 tons of biochar and 4.16 of these tons are carbon, we're increasing soil organic carbon, not soil organic matter, soil organic carbon by 0.146 or by 0.416%, which is a huge amount of carbon. So that's how you do that. I want to say that Josiah is going to talk about calculators later, so don't rush through and write this down, because I think these slides will be available, and Josiah is going to show you some tools where you don't need to do this manually. Again, this value is really easy to calculate if you just know those three values: the amount of organic carbon, the water content, and the application rate. So what about soil fertility? How much am I offsetting my fertilizer needs by adding a bunch of biochar? Again, your lab report informs that answer. So the values of NPK shown on the report, so in this case, it's down here, are reported in dry weight in parts per million or milligrams of biochar per kilogram, or milligrams per kilogram soil. And so just ppm, or parts per million, is the same as milligrams per kilogram. People get confused about that a lot. Again, the values that are shown on this particular biochar are really low. And for the most part, if you've got a really small ash fraction, in this case, the ash fraction is 2.4%, you're likely to have low amounts of P and K in your biochar. Almost all biochars have low amounts of nitrogen. So I wouldn't expect to see high nitrogen values. These values are 10 for nitrogen, 3985 for potassium, and 460 for phosphorus. So how do we get there? So a biochar that has 50% moisture content has half of this fertility value, right? So farmers don't tend to think in ppm or milligrams per kilogram. So we need to convert all of these amounts to pound per acre. To do this, I'm just going to multiply by a conversion factor. That's 0.002. If you're wondering where that number came from, I'm happy to go through the conversion, but it's not that important, but it's 0.002. And that changes our units from milligrams to kilogram to pounds per ton. And then I just multiply the weight, the weight values by the application rate to come up with how many pounds per acre we're adding. So you can see that in this case, and then of course I have to account for the wet weight of biochar. So what you can see is that in this case, if I make all those conversions, then we've got the nitrogen value is 0.1 pound per acre if I'm putting on 10 tons. If for potassium, it's 39 pounds per acre, which is a lot of potassium for sure. And for phosphorus, it's 4.57 pounds an acre. But in general, biochars are going to have pretty low fertilizer value. And just to put this in perspective, the most value here is in the K, which is about 1/3 the amount needed to fertilize an acre of corn. Okay. So what about lime? Does adding this biochar help offset lime? If we look at the analysis, it'll show two values, the pH and the calcium carbonate equivalents. pH is really important, but it doesn't determine the amount of liming power that a biochar can offer. So let's look at the calcium carbonate equivalents, which is exactly that. The equivalent to lime is essentially what calcium carbonate equivalence is. Here it says that it's 2.5%, meaning that it's 40 times less potent than lime. But it's still something to consider, especially if your calcium carbonate equivalence numbers are higher. I've seen calcium equivalence numbers up to 30% in really high ash biochars. So to calculate how much neutralizing power we're adding, we're going to take the decimal percent calcium carbonate equivalence, and we're going to multiply that by the amendment rate, and then multiply that by the moisture content. And this comes to 0.12 tons of calcium carbonate per acre, which isn't a lot. But again, if you're applying a biochar with a higher ash content, it could really offset a lime budget. Okay, again, there's lots of data contained in this report. Many we will not use to determine how the biochar reacts in soil. But again, values like metals are really important to quantify and understand so that we don't contribute to heavy metal pollution in agricultural systems. Okay, so how much biochar is in a ton? And this is a really important question. We can use the bulk density measurement to figure it out. Here, the labs report that the bulk density is 11.3 pounds per cubic foot. To change those values to yards, I need to multiply the value by 27. And if I do that, I get that it's 301 pounds per yard, right? From there, we can switch this to tons by dividing by 2,000. And when we do that, we get that there's 6.6 yards per ton. To get wet weight values, I need to divide the number of the dry pounds by the moisture content fraction to get that there's 613 pounds per yard in a wet biochar. And this, again, if you switch that over to tons, you can get that it's 3.3 yards per ton. So all this information is useful and interesting, but unless a grower can make the economics of biochar work, it's not going to be applied. So to help farmers make the decision about whether or not it's economical, we developed some economic tools as well. So I'm going to hop back to the atlas. So to determine if this makes economic sense, we've developed this cost-benefit analysis tool. And we can use this to determine if adding biochar to improve the growth of whatever crop we're growing makes sense. And here I'm just going to use potatoes as an example. And within the tool, we can enter in numbers. Here we assumed that there were 500 pounds of that the biochar was $500 a ton. The potato price is $9 per hundredweight, and a yield of 600 hundredweight per acre, and that we were going to get a 5% increase in yield. And you can see that with these assumptions, again, here's the crop values that we put in. And we also have a functionality where you can offset the cost of your fertilizer as well. So here we're saying that we're going to lower our nitrogen costs, we're going to lower our phosphorus costs and our potassium costs and our liming costs. And if we do all that, it'll spit out that the farmer was able to make profit over 5 years, assuming that there's no change. So in this scenario, biochar makes sense in a potato crop, but what about other crops? So here's just, a quick analysis, and you can see that at a biochar cost of either $1,000 or $500 an acre. So this would be $500 an acre would be this gray line here. $1,000 per hectare would be this black line here, and you can see that over if biochar costs $1,000 per hectare, then the only crop that we evaluated out of all of these that would make money is potatoes. However, if we can lower that cost to under $500 a hectare, then other crops start to make sense, including things like alfalfa. And you can see that wheat is really hard to make money on. However, this does not take into account the carbon practice standards that are being implemented by the NRCS. So we just spent a whole day listening to NRCS folks talk about this practice standard, but by subsidizing this cost, we may be able to make a substantial difference in the economic paradigm that really limits a farmer's ability to make money using biochar, especially in commodity crops. Okay, so thankful to the NRCS. So the NRCS last year initiated an agreement with the Agricultural Research Service to expand this tool across the United States. I've mentioned several times that this tool is really focused on Pacific Northwest agriculture, our crops, our soils, our biochars. But now we have the ability, thanks to the NRCS, to expand that to the entire United States, including Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands. We're going to not only add a lot of geographical information into this tool, but we're also going to expand the functional tool as well. But we couldn't do that without our partners. Again, thanks to that agreement, we have this whole slate of partners that's going to help us with this effort. We're going to significantly expand the biochar library. This is going to be done with 10 USDA ARS labs across the country. And so hopefully we'll be able to put hundreds of commercially and regionally relevant biochars into the decision support tool so that folks can choose something that makes sense for this farm. If you're a biochar producer and you're interested in having your biochar listed, please contact me and we'll test it here, provide you those results, and then put the biochar on the atlas. We're also going to be developing a life cycle analysis model that predicts greenhouse gas emission consequences of making and applying biochar, and that includes carbon sequestration. We're hoping to use this model to develop a biochar module that can be implemented in Comet Farm, which is a planning tool that's used by technical service providers and conservation planners. That work is going to be done in collaboration with ORISE, which is a federal agency, and Jim Amonette at WSU. We're going to be working with Adam Lindsley at Oregon State University to implement the model and develop the webpage. The USBI is going to be working with biochar producers to help us gather biochar samples, create fact sheets, conduct webinars, and get feedback on the tool. And then American Farmland Trust is going to be leading outreach efforts, including developing fact sheets, guidance to farmers through trainings, but they're also going to provide inReach back to the NRCS to provide workshops and trainings to conservation planners and other technical support providers. So as part of this effort, I really encourage you to go to the webpage. Again, that's pnw.biochar.org. And play around with it. See what works, see what doesn't, and please email me. You see my email up here. It's a typical government email, which is just first.lastname@usda.gov. We really want to make an effort to make this functional for everyone and make it useful. And getting feedback on the front end is really going to help inform that. So thank you so much for your time, and I'll be around to answer questions.
Thank you. Hey, so we do have a number of questions for you in the Q&A. We have one. It says, Kristin, in your case study, the SOM was 4.6%. As you said, the SOM was already very high. Why apply more biochar in this field and not target a different field with lower SOM? Additionally, in your opinion, should we expect USDA to assist with funding biochar applications to a field with an SOM of 4.6?
Yeah, no, it's a great point. And like I said, this is one part of the farmer's field. And I am not aware of how all the conservation practices are sort of ranked. But I think Alana said yesterday that carbon dioxide removal was absolutely conservation practice. And so in this case, it would help the farmer to apply it if there was a compelling reason. But yeah, I agree. 4.6% is huge, especially in that area where the average SOC is like 0.5%. So he's already done a great job of applying carbon to his farm.
Yeah, thanks for that. Then the next question is, could this tool be used for compost? Compost, or is there a similar tool for compost?
Wouldn't that be cool? I'd love to include compost in this, and I've been trying to think of ways to do it. Compost is so variable. I think it's going to be hard. You know, once a biochar is produced, it changes a little bit, right, as it ages. It actually changes a lot in soil as it ages, but as it's sitting on the lot for 3 months, it's not going to change a whole lot. Whereas compost, if it's not pulled, it could change substantially. So if you've got ideas about how to do that, please contact me, because I'd love to create one of these for compost. I think it would be super useful.
Yeah, agreed. That would be great. And that we answered that live. Brewer Logan has comment and question. Research has shown an increase in protein and other macros of crops after biochar and compost addition. Does the cost of saving or increased revenue per acre consider an increase in crop quality?
I think that you could fit that into the current economic analysis. What we might do is we could, and I think that's a good idea, is you know, how much, maybe it's not yield that's increasing, but maybe it's value that's increasing. And so what you could do within the tool, I'm not sharing my screen anymore, but I'm going to go back and look at it. What you could do within the tool, maybe once I get back here, I can share it. It's going to take me a second. Yeah, so let me share this real quick. I'm just going to share my screen. I'm not going to present it, but if you can see here is that we've got this crop value tab, and so you could change the on-farm price to reflect that you're doing that. Does that make sense?
Yes. Yeah. Oh, here's thank you for that. And here's a question from, well, first I'm going to go, somebody said the weight per acre was described as 1,000 tons. Can you clarify what was the depth? Because the participant missed that.
Oh, 6.7 inches. So an acre furrow slice is what, 2 million pounds? Is that right?
Okay.
Yeah.
So a question about anybody, when somebody submits biochar to the library, when they submit it and it's tested, could those results then be used to apply to other government programs? Would those tests carry any weight in that regard?
It's a really good
question. That's a great question. Yeah.
Yeah, we are not a certified lab. So it depends on what the particular program requires. If they require testing done by a certified NAPT lab, we are not going to meet that criteria.
Okay. I'm just typing it as well. There we go. Do some biochars contain high enough levels of PAHs or heavy metals that would warrant limits to application rates? Do standard biochar tests measure those levels? And does the NRCS standard require that this composition is determined?
For metals, for sure, there is. I think the PAH standards are really generous for biochars. Most of the biochar tests I have seen do not quantify what's in the volatile fraction of the char. It just says that there's a volatile fraction. There's another test that you can get done that costs a lot more money to show you what's exactly in that volatile fraction. But I'm not sure which labs are providing that information. In our testing, we're not going to look at volatiles. We'll do metals, but we're not going to look at volatiles. There are definitely standards for metals, and it should, again, it's all going to be in context of like what if you're like, I work with a farmer in Idaho, right, who's right along the Coeur d'Alene River. He has crazy amounts of metals in his soils. There's no amount of biochar that we're going to add that's going to contribute to that. In fact, it would probably dilute the current metals that he has in his system.
Yeah, good input. So Muriel is asking if different types of biochar can be combined when the best kind isn't just one kind.
Oh, good question. We haven't thought about blends. That's a great idea. Like we could say,
yeah,
some of those biochar. I love that. That's a great idea.
It's been coming up a lot lately in discussions that we've had with folks.
Yeah.
They're saying, well, because you know, in Utah, we have a lot of pine, so the conifers are like, it's really excellent for the water holding capacity, but may not be the best carrier for some other strategy that they have.
Yeah, the other functionality that we don't have, and maybe what we could do is create a calculator where you could put in like your own analyses and have it spit something out. And that way you could say, well, how much, you know, if I have a compost and a biochar, I could put in some analyses with the compost analysis and then with the biochar analysis and then pick a blend, right? I think we could do that.
Yeah. It seems like it's the future. I mean, we do that with our other inoculants, right? So it's all about balance and measure. And that also brings up the good point. You know, we were talking about this yesterday about biochar being a magic bullet. There is, we need to reiterate, there is no such thing as the perfect biochar. There's only the perfect biochar for the application. So that means you need to realize your soil structure, what your goals and objectives are, what your nutrient plan is, and act accordingly. So just because it says biochar doesn't mean it's the right biochar for your use case. But please do stick with us. Somebody did have a question about what if your feedstock's a mixed feedstock? I guess because that gets us into a blend no matter what.
If you have a mixed feedstock and you want to send us your biochar, we're happy to characterize it. It's not gonna, you know, as long as you have the characterization test, it doesn't really matter what it's made from because we can put that information on the atlas and somebody can choose, oh, my biochar is 50% manure and 50% wood, right? Or if you're a commercial biochar producer and you want to say that, you know, we're rogue biochar and this is our, you know, what you can expect from a typical batch, then you can look that up and figure it out. So.
Right. And a lot of commercial, I think one thing to point out is that a lot of commercial biochar producers typically deal with single types of feedstocks. Like, for example, I deal with just a conifer blend because it's the sawmill that I get my material from. They're, you know, that's what they're dealing with exclusively. They're not touching hardwood. So, and so in bioenergy, you might find that it's a specific type of tree. So there's a question about the atlas. Does it help those that are choosing biochar for water filtration versus only for ag? That'd be interesting to expand the market for biochar. I know this market's trying to figure out how to use biochar as well.
So we've talked a lot about that. I would love to add functionality for binding toxins and nutrients. I think that would be super cool to do. I've been in touch with folks at OSU who have sort of that expertise and can help me build the theoretical framework we would need to present that. Now all we need is the funding. So
we always need funding. If anybody wants to sponsor a project, reach out to Kristin or contact us at USBI. We can help you out. I know that's one of the ongoing issues with this industry. I mean, we're talking about agriculture today, but I mean, it's used in construction materials, insulation, plastic integration. Like it's carbon. It's a simple material, but it has elegant solutions, right?
Yeah, and I think that any of these sorts of application and uses, whether it's in potting media or drywall or used to bind a toxin, I think all of those have the same relationship where you can describe the properties of the biochar, describe what properties you need, and make a match. I don't think any of that. I think that's all a great idea, and I'm happy to do the work if we can find some funding. But we're looking for funding. Is what I'll say is that we're actively, you know, talking to our national program officers. We're actively working with other agencies like the EPA on whether or not we can find funds to do this. So
yeah. So what I want to do is I want to ask you about 4 or 5 more questions before we go on to Josiah. There are 2 questions that I'm going to combine kind of into one. One is about could you extrapolate on the HC ratio? Is a high ratio a good thing? And then the follow-up to that is addressing sizing and how size of the biochar influences performance in soil.
Yeah, so both really good questions. So the HC ratio, I think the HC ratio is good. The OC ratio is, especially if you're trying to bind things and create microbial communities from biochar, it is good to have, more functionality within your biochar molecules. We can add pure graphite, which is what, biochar with a really low to C rate, high H to C ratio would look like. And that's great for stability, but again, it depends on what your choices are. So I think adding something that has both permanence and something that adds food for microbes is important. So I think a balance is good. Other people, again, it depends on your goals. If you're trying to provide carbon credits, you're going to want something with a really low HC ratio, because that's going to have more of a permanence than
the higher carbon.
Yeah. I hope that answers your question. If not, feel free to ask.
Yeah, I think that's pretty good. I think some of the folks might have questions about the durability when it's in soil based on the HC ratio and the OC ratio. I know it took me quite a long time to figure it out myself. So so yeah, so it's a good one.
And then the other one was
the sizing.
Yeah, so sizing isn't like when you get biochar out of your production system, obviously it looks a lot like what you put in, right? So if you put in big chunks, you're going to get out big chunks. If you put in small chunks, you're going to get out smaller chunks. But all of that is sizable. We don't have the theoretical frame. What size is really important for is surface area, and size is also really important for water holding capacity. So things like sorption, and things like how much water can it hold. There's no good theoretical framework right now that says if you add this size particle into this texture of soil, this is going to be how much more water you have. I wish we had that theoretical framework. We don't. What I will say is that if you want to increase your water holding capacity and you're in a sandy soil, add silt sized particles. But I don't have that recommendation yet. So unfortunately, the particle size functionality within our tool is not very useful. And in fact, if you add that in as one of your goals, it's going to say add a really small size biochar. Don't add big coarse granules, because that's going to make it go quicker.
Yeah. So I have noticed a number of studies that have shown 1 to 3 millimeters in size is typically kind of the optimal for water holding capacity and nutrient distribution. But again, it's always with the caveat of it depends really on what your application is.
And it really depends on what soil type you have. So
I know.
Like if you have a clay, you don't want to, if you have a silty one, it's dependent. And it's something we can talk about when we're building this tool. I just don't know that we're going to come up with something that's
and we can talk about it a little bit more, I think, in Josiah's session as well. So John Reese is asking, depending on the IBI analysis of the biochar, could compost inoculant choice be used to create a balanced solution of sequestration and fertilizer?
Can you read that again?
It's basically saying if you add compost to it, it doesn't provide a balance. So that way it works for your sequestration and possibly your carbon credits as well as the fertilizer.
Oh, I am a huge fan of applying biochar compost mixtures. I think it's a synergy. So Phil's session will cover on that a little bit later on, and that kind of tends to be the overall goal for soil health, is a combination of the stable carbon plus the biology that's afforded from your compost. Let's see. There was one more question I wanted to catch. Folks are asking when's the timeline when you'll be able to accept the samples. February. So we just hired a technician that's going to coordinate all of this and start accepting samples. So if you have something, pop me an email at kristin.trippe@usda.gov and we'll get it in here and we'll get it going. So.
And then on that inoculation front, any data or resources covering different types of inoculation being used with biochar prior to implementation? I don't entirely understand if that means post creation of the biochar, or maybe they're trying to reference addendums added to the feedstock before it's made, so we can get maybe more phosphorus uptake. Like that. So.
I think it's going to depend on what you're adding and when you're adding it in the process. But again, if you've got a biochar that's all ready to go post-process, send it to us and we'll evaluate it. And it shouldn't matter if you added like a bunch of rock dust in the beginning of the processing, that should show up in the lab report. So please send it away. And again, thank you guys for all your time. I super appreciate your input.
Yeah, Kristin, thanks for letting me put you on the spot with all those questions. It was a fantastic presentation, so thank you so much. Look forward to you connecting with us later on in the presentation for the Q&As.
And with that, we wrap up a fantastic day 2, session 1 with Kristin Trippe. Wow, that conversation was just amazing. Thank you, Kristin, and also want to give a thank you to Richard Reid, USDA Soil Science, for his web soil survey. Also a fantastic presentation, powerhouse back-to-back like that. We couldn't do this without our sponsors. Thank you to the U.S. Forest Service, the U.S. Composting Council, American Farmland Trust, Grain Ecosystems, BOW ASA, Wakefield Biochar, and Go Biochar. Day 2, session 2 is on its way. We're going to be speaking with Pacific Biochar and Josiah Hunt and his co-worker and soil installer, Charlie. They're going to have some fantastic information, and Josiah will be revealing the new USBI soil carbon calculation tool for biochar application. Again, day 2, USDA NRCS code 336 and 808 soil carbon amendment program. Thank you for joining. Be sure to like and subscribe.